Welcome again, everybody. Happy Identity Management Day. Hope the sessions are going great for you so far. My name is Ravi Irikola. I'm a co-chair for Identity Management Day 2023 and happy to be co-chairing for a second time this year. Reiterating the theme for this year's Identity Management Day is be identity smart, be cyber smart. The key aspect of being identity smart is being smart with your passwords as well. As you know, managing passwords has been, managing them securely has been a challenge for many days for many people. Compromised credentials continues to be one of the key causes behind majority of the cybersecurity attacks that you see today. And particularly today, with the proliferation of cloud applications, the digital evolution, managing your online credentials, how you authenticate to various systems, it's super important more than ever. In that aspect, to give us an overview of where authentication is today and what is the future of the authentication, I welcome Andrew Shikiar, Executive Director and CMO at FIDO Alliance. Take it over, Andrew.
Hey, Robbie, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks to IDSA, and it's great to be taking part in this very important day, Identity Management Day. I've been in the identity space, yikes, for something like over 20 years, and it's been really interesting to watch the industry at large progress on some of the objectives, some of the lofty objectives we set back in the early 2000s, making that become a reality. But one common thread, as Robbie said, is that we've been dependent on fundamental authentication technology for all that time and beyond, a technology and an approach that's fundamentally flawed. And that, of course, is the password. And we've been talking about moving beyond the password for years now, many years. What I want to share with you all today is where we stand on this path to passwordless, where FIDO Alliance fits in, and a somewhat optimistic view on our ability to collectively move beyond our dependence on passwords. So, let's start with the problem statement. These are some data points that stem directly from our dependence on passwords. And frankly, I could spend the entire 30 minutes that we have together today with slide after slide after slide illustrating the damages that passwords cause. Simply put, they're a liability for the enterprise and for organizations. And they're also not a very user-friendly experience either. We've become so accustomed to using passwords to sign in. And what if you pause for a second and ask the question, why am I using 60-year-old technology to sign into websites? Is there a better way? And the answer is yes, there is a better way, which is not relying on passwords. But the fact of the matter is, we talk, more and more, you'll talk about 2FA, MFA. Yes, these are all solutions and ways to address the fact that we have a fundamentally flawed primary factor of passwords. When we depend on passwords, you see a large number of breaches. Like over 80% of breaches are caused by weak or stolen passwords. Furthermore, we see a lot of malware and phishing emails all taking advantage of the fact that people are dependent on knowledge-based credentials. It's not just these kind of bottom line threats of with fraud expenses and things like that. There's also opportunity cost when you see upwards of a third of online purchases being abandoned because consumers cannot remember their password. In fact, our own data shows that within the past 3 to 6 months, over 50% of people have had a password, have forgotten their password at point of checkout. So think about all that lost revenue opportunity as well due to this dependence on passwords. And as a result, what we've done is add layers, right? So, well, a password we know is not good enough, so we need to add secondary, third, fourth added factors on top of the primary factor of passwords. And so all these things are well intended and absolutely necessary. So to be clear, any form of 2FA is better than a password alone. But the fact of the matter is, legacy 2FA, things like SMS OTP, these are band-aids to the core problem. And not only are they band-aids, they're pretty weak band-aids, right? So more and more we're seeing very effective MFA bypass attacks that are becoming increasingly sophisticated and increasing in volume as well. So what this points to is the fact that we need to make a fundamental shift from the way we've always done authentication, which is kind of legacy knowledge-based credentialing, things things that are in your head, such as passwords. All right, but these are typically stored on a server. They are human readable more often than not, or depend on a human action. These are all susceptible to common remote attacks, scalable remote attacks that are, again, these are the breaches you hear about, hundreds of millions of accounts or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of accounts being taken over at once through very clever remote attacks. We need to move away from that kind of knowledge-based approach to credentialing to something that's more possession-based, in your hand. So from something in your head to something that's more inherent to who you are. So moving from passwords to passkeys. These are always things that are done locally on device, never on a server. It could be a local biometric. It could be a local device pin. It's basically moving away from a centralized model that is very susceptible to attacks to a more decentralized model that allows users to authenticate to the device that's already in their fingertips through the same action that they're most likely taking dozens of times a day, such as using a biometric to unlock your phone or your PC. The key distinguishing thing here for phishing-resistant modern approach to authentication is that it must be user-initiated and cryptographically secure. So let's talk about what that means in a little bit more detail. And this is, I'm alluding to FIDO authentication, or really any form of asymmetric public key cryptography, which is what underpins FIDO authentication. So historically, this is how we've logged in, right? So there's a user, and then there's a password on the server. If you know the password in your head and you enter it correctly, then you're granted access to the server. The problem with this model is that the threat is what lays between. In this gap in between here, you can actually have a bad actor can sit there. They can steal your password. They can phish your password. They can guess your password. It's this void that creates so many problems that we face today. So what FIDO is doing is introducing something called the authenticator. The authenticator essentially mediates the authentication relationship, the authentication process. The authenticator is both a concept and a physical thing that sits locally on the user's device. So as opposed to the old model where you had a password sitting on the server and a password in the user's head, what we have is a unique key pair. There's a public key that sits on the server, and then a private key that sits securely on the user's device. The private key is dedicated to each app, and that's where a lot of the value comes in. As opposed to a password, if someone steals your public key, that's fine. Like, there's no material value to your public key. It can't be repurposed to take over your accounts. The private key is a sensitive piece that, again, stays local on your user's device, as opposed to on a server where people can get those at scale. For the user to register or to enroll for FIDO authentication, they must verify themselves to that device. So the user verification is done locally with a single gesture. So again, this is typically your PIN. It could be a biometric. It could be a security key. It's all local, single gesture from the user. Once the user verifies himself, they're enrolled for FIDO authentication when it comes time to actually authenticate. After the verification is done, you see this challenge response dialogue between the key pair, between the server and the authenticator. That's the cryptographic communication between the keys that allows the user to be securely authenticated. Right, so it's like encrypted communication that allows for safer user authentication, but it's all done through a very simple single user gesture. So in a nutshell, that's how asymmetric public key cryptography works. The key thing to understand, and our key belief, is that no one should have to know how to say, let alone understand, what asymmetric public key cryptography is for people to use it. And that's been FIDO's vision since day one. This is who FIDO Alliance is. We have over 40 companies on our board of directors. We have over 250 members worldwide. The logos you see there, this is our board. Really, I think that the most important thing about this set of companies is that if you ask yourself the question, who do we need to have sitting around the table to solve the world's password problem, it'd probably look a lot like this. All right, so we have the platform providers who are building the operating systems that all of us use on a daily basis. We have the chipset providers that power the devices that we all use at scale. We have the OEMs and the device manufacturers as well. We have experts in biometrics, security, identity management. Then last but not least, we have the service providers. Businesses are dependent upon us getting this right? They need to deliver high assurance services to billions of users worldwide, and are really feeling the pain of passwords. They're bringing the use cases into Fido Alliance, and then work side by side with the rest of the community to build our specifications, our protocols, and best practices for moving to passwordless authentication. So, why do this? Why would I use FIDO authentication? Why would I move to a passwordless approach to authentication? There's two key aspects here. One is your bottom line, right? So that I opened up with statistics about the number of breaches, increase in phishing attacks. All those things are extremely expensive, right? So if you suffer a breach, you're looking at millions or tens of millions of dollars of direct costs, not to mention the reputational cost if you have consumers affected as well. Additionally, passwords have hard costs inside the enterprise, right? So if your employees can't sign into things because they can't remember their password, that's a productivity hit. And think about the support desk costs associated with password resets, or again, dealing with consumer or with employees who are having a hard time accessing systems. Additionally, there are kind of top line benefits. All right, so we have a very mini case study here from a financial services software provider who used FIDO for consumer sign-ins. And what they found was a higher success rate, a reduction to time to sign in, and a higher registration rate on mobile apps for people who are using FIDO authentication. So what that means is that not only are they protecting their bottom line by reducing fraud, but they're actually expanding their top line by allowing more of their customers to securely access their content and their services. And so it's a little wonder that we've seen strong global market adoption. FIDO specifications have been on market now for several years. We've seen, this is just a partial list of companies that have deployed FIDO's, our core protocols for user authentication. It spans industries, it spans borders, it spans use cases. We're seeing broad early adoption, if you will, in all market segments and all corners of the world. But one thing we've learned is that usability is the key to FIDO adoption at scale. FIDO Alliance's tagline is simpler, stronger authentication. And what's interesting to me is that the conversations I've had over the past few years have really shifted from coming from a security posture, which is asking about, well, how do I stop attacks? How secure is this? How to prevent phishing? To more and more talking about usability, which is, well, how does this impact my customer? Will my employees like using this? And we've seen that through these various big brands who've deployed FIDO at scale. While we've seen good progress, it's not reaching our full mission, which is to reduce, if not eliminate, the world's dependence on passwords. And so for FIDO to be adopted at scale, especially for consumers, we need greater usability. And that's why recently we've been talking about Passkeys. All right, you may have heard about Passkeys. Passkey is actually the term we now use for any FIDO credential, but when we announced this last May, what we're talking about, so this was announced jointly with Google, Apple, and Microsoft. The fundamental shift here is allowing the private key, so going back to the diagram I had, the private key to be securely synced across a operating system cloud or a password manager type cloud. The beauty of FIDO's security and FIDO's approach with public key cryptography is that there's a unique key pair for each device. The challenge has been that the user needs to enroll each new device for each service. So if I go to ecommercesite.com and I choose to enroll for FIDO authentication, that's great on that one device I have, say I'm on my iPhone. But then when I go later on to access the same site on my iPad, historically I've had to then re-enroll that device. So that brings two sets of challenges. One is that as a user, it's counterintuitive, right? If I'm using things like, say, iCloud Keychain or devices on a daily basis, credential to be there already. And if it's not there, it raises questions in my mind. Why do I need to enroll each device for each service? But secondly, there's a security risk here as well, which is that we're forcing that service provider to keep that password front and center for the consumer to then enroll subsequent devices. So by allowing the private key to sync, now the user experience is such that when I enroll for a site, say ecommerceprovider.com on one device, when I go to another device in that same ecosystem, my passkey will automatically be there. So now in that example, when I go to my iPad, I'll automatically be able to just use that passkey rather than enrolling that new device. And so that's the fundamental shift we've made with passkeys, the ability for passkeys to sync across the cloud. I think what's unique about this is that this has been, widely embraced, by the core operating system vendors. We jointly announced this with them last May. Apple, Google, Microsoft, committed to support this concept within their platforms and their operating systems, and we've seen this go live, right? So passkey support, or synced passkey support, is now live in iOS and macOS across Apple operating systems. It's live in Chrome OS and Android, and we'll see OS level support from Microsoft later on this year. Furthermore, we've seen many service providers move to support this vision with their own implementations. So PayPal is allowing you to use passkeys across your devices in the US initially, and we'll be rolling out globally. We see Entity Docomo, Shopify, SKT, Kayak, Yahoo Japan. These are just some of the service providers who are supporting passkey sign-ins for their consumers. Additionally, I'm highlighting 1Password and Dashlane. These are important companies that are in the business of being password managers. They've also embraced passkeys and announced their intent to do two things. One, allow users to use a passkey to actually access their password vaults, but separately, they've announced intent to allow their password managers to also manage passkeys. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So while a lot of the focus on passkeys has been for that consumer use case, there's also a great opportunity in enterprise. Now, that's great, but also it does bring a unique set of considerations in the enterprise. But I think one thing to think about is that more and more businesses, especially SMEs, are moving to what I'll call BYOD authentication. So allowing their employees to, or actually asking their employees to use their personal device for authentication. So it might be an app, for example, on your mobile phone. For those use cases, passkeys are a very natural fit. Also, for use cases where enterprises are using a cloud service, so say something like Azure AD or some similar from other cloud service providers, all these things have support for FIDO authentication, and will have support for passkeys built in. The fact of the matter is, it's still far too few enterprises are actually moving to passwordless authentication, or even using MFA today. Right? I believe the MFA penetration rates around 30 to 40% of enterprises. So passkeys stand to dramatically increase the number of enterprises that can move to MFA and to a passwordless approach instead of depending on passwords and legacy 2FA. But coming back to the enterprise considerations, so BYOD is a very natural thing. So there may be some more complex enterprise requirements that would require added proofing signals. So one thing we do lose by allowing the private key to sync is the addressability of that assigned key. So there will be some scenarios where the enterprise wants to know that the person who is signing in is on the same device that they used when they enrolled for FIDO authentication. In those scenarios, the enterprise can look for what we'll call device-bound passkey, being for years by enterprises around the world to sign in their employees. You could also choose to do added proofing signals or other step-up mechanisms on top of the passkey for those enterprises that have stronger regulatory or security requirements. Enterprise is a very important space for us. I know for many of the attendees, you are looking at identity management purely from the sense of how to authenticate your employees. That's all being addressed either today or in the future through our protocols and through our best practices. This is a very active area of discussion within Fido Alliance. One other thing I want to hit on is the importance of having a robust Passkey ecosystem. So one of the questions we got when we announced Passkeys last year with Google, Apple, and Microsoft was, well, hey, isn't this just a big lock-in for the big three tech vendors, for big tech? And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. So while initially those are the initial companies that are in position to be a passkey provider, that was never the vision, right? So I talked earlier about 1Password, about Dashlane, Inside FIDO Alliance, we also have LastPass on our board. We have Bitwarden, NordPass. Many companies who are in the business of being password managers are in FIDO Alliance, and they, universally intend to support passkeys alongside passwords. And this is a very important part of our vision for passkeys, is to allow for third-party providers. This creates choice, it creates competition, and ultimately, I think, will strengthen the user experience and the overall approach for passkeys and passkey implementations. So work is underway inside of FIDO Alliance to allow to ensure that third-party passkey providers have the proper infrastructure, the proper security, and proper procedures in place to securely serve as passkey providers for consumers and for businesses. So more on that is coming soon. So coming back to wrap up, I want to talk about usability a little bit. Usability is one of the most important things we're doing in FIDO Alliance. As a body, what we do 3 core things. We create technical specifications, we run marketing programs, but we also focus on guidance and best practices for how companies can successfully deploy FIDO authentication. That last piece, UX, is front and center in what we're doing. And so over the past couple of years, we've delivered a couple key things. First of all, we released the UX guidelines. So these are, if you go to our site and go to FIDO, or just search FIDO Alliance UX guidelines, you'll see the guidelines we did in 2021 for platform authenticators. And that's basically the use case of if someone wanted to enroll say using Windows Hello or Touch ID on a MacBook, what's the right way to do that? And through that process, what we learned is that this is less a technical issue than it is a understanding the user journey issue. All right, so we broke down the user journey for someone who wishes to enroll in FIDO authentication from the moment they access the website on through to the message they're being prompted with to choose to use a passwordless sign-in flow, to the iconography, on through to login, to sign out, to customer support. There's so many steps in this journey, and we broke down each one of them, tested each step, and ultimately produced data-driven guidance on the best way to do that. The feedback on those UX guidelines was so positive that we actually launched a UX working group. And this is a working body inside of FIDO Alliance comprised of design and user experience leads from some of the biggest brands on the planet. And they're actively helping guide and make sure that everything coming out of FIDO Alliance has usability and accessibility in mind. One of the key things this body produced was the FIDO design system. The FIDO design system is actually a system that is freely available for any of you to use, that guides you on the user journey I talked about before, and the considerations at each step, and design thinking as you seek to implement FIDO authentication for whatever audience you may be concerned about, whether that's consumers or employees. The design system can be applied there. In 2023, we've done a couple of things. First of all, we've actually released specific guidance on accessibility. Users who have accessibility requirements are absolutely critical. So we've given guidance on how to contemplate, say someone who is, non-sighted, right? How do you talk about a biometric? How do you prompt them to use a security key or to use a device pin if they have some sort of cognitive challenges? So we have very specific guidance on how to address users with accessibility requirements. And then last but not least, we have research underway on the Passkey user journey. Right? It's a different user journey than the traditional kind of platform authenticator approach. We're learning a lot through this research, and we will be issuing UX guidelines for Passkey later on this year. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much. I'd like to thank IDSA again for having me. I believe we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to take those now. Robbie, back to you.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks again for the great session. There are a couple of questions on the backstage. The first one is, I missed whether it's just Dashline or other password managers specifically that are adopting FIDO or primary authentication and even managing keys. Could you touch upon those again?
Yeah, so I think the two password manager providers who have announced their intent to support Passkeys are Dashlane and 1Password. I mentioned other companies that are in that business that are active within FIDO Alliance, including LastPass, including Bitwarden, including NordPass, and there's a couple others. But the two that I'm aware of that have publicly announced support are Dashlane and 1Password.
Got it, got it. And then another question, Andrew, is it is great to see more companies embrace passkeys. Is the FIDO Alliance working with the companies to lock down the fallback to SMS OTP, which can circumvent hardware key MFA?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Working with companies lock down the fallback to SMS. So, SMS OTP is better than a password alone. SMS OTP has the advantage of ubiquity, right? And I think that it's for a lot of use cases, it's sufficient. That being said, it is entirely phishable. The SMS, the only difference between like the OTP and a password is that it's shorter lived. The same phishing toolkits you can use to phish a password can be used to phish SMS OTP. So we believe that falls in the legacy camp, and people should be moving to possession-based forms of MFA, preferably FIDO authentication. So yes, we're working to just move people away from depending on SMS OTP entirely. And the nice thing is, one reason why people have used SMS OTP in the past is that I talked about ubiquity. That was really the least bad option. With FIDO support being built into literally every device that's probably in everyone's fingertips right now, the necessity to use SMS OTP starts to go away. Right? If you can just leverage the built-in biometric of a Android device or an iPhone device, that's now a very viable option.
Thanks, Andrew. Another question, what are the vulnerabilities, if there are any, of passkeys, especially if they're created at scale from partners outside of major players such as Microsoft, Apple, Google?
Yeah, so the vulnerabilities of what are the vulnerabilities of passkeys that are created at scale from providers? Well, I think that hits on a key point I was trying to get to. So we understand the sensitivity around this and how important it is to make sure that passkeys are securely managed. Apple and Google have released statements on how they're protecting their clouds. Right? Ultimately, it comes down to what's the strength of that cloud? What's the strength of iCloud? What's the strength of Google Cloud? And what will be the strength of the third-party passkey provider clouds? And so when I said we're working to create a secure mechanism to allow for third-party passkey providers, we're doing exactly that. One thing FIDO Alliance does, which I did not talk about, I was remiss to not talk about actually, is we run a very robust certification program. So we certify products, servers, we certify authenticators. We also have a security certification program that attests to the security levels of an authenticator. So I think what you'll see us coming out with is a program that talks about, I'll use the term in quotes right now, say a FIDO certified passkey provider. To become that passkey provider will have to prove to our security secretariat that their cloud sufficiently protects users' passkeys, right, when they're created or managed by that provider. And also that the authenticator being used, probably in an app or whatever it might be, is also FIDO certified. So I think those are ways to mitigate any vulnerabilities of passkeys being managed by third parties. But ultimately, the core thing comes down to making sure that passkey is managed and used only by that user, rather than by a third party.
Thank you, Andrew. Looks like that's all the questions that we have. We are 1 minute. We have 1 minute left. Wanted to see if you have any closing comments before we end the session.
No, I hope everyone found the conversation to be of value. If anyone's interested in learning more about FIDO Alliance or Passkeys, visit our website, fidoalliance.org. I'll put a plug in for a conference we have. We have a conference called Authenticate. It's taking place in October in San Diego. For those who want to get deeper into learning the ins and outs of the best ways to deploy passkeys, I'd encourage you to attend this. We will have lots of case studies from companies that have deployed passkeys at scale within the enterprise and to consumers. There'll be a great chance to learn and be part of the community.
All right. Thanks a lot. Again, Andrew, thanks everybody for joining the session.
Thank you, Ravi.